Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
And we're particularly pleased to welcome our first speaker of this morning. That's Professor Ronald Numbers, who is the Hilldale Professor of the History of Science and Medicine at Wisconsin-Madison University. And he's also been there actually for 3 decades, so he's taught there for a very long time. Ron has also written a huge number of books. I meant to bring a couple to wave around, but I'm sure I hope you'll find a number of his books on the bookstore. And one of the most recent ones, in fact, has been the second edition of his book, The Creationists, a big fat volume which I do thoroughly recommend. I can't say I finished it yet. Ron very kindly sent me a copy. And it is really the definitive work, I would say, on the history of creationism, not only in America but also in other parts of the world. And it brings it right up to date with the ID movement and so forth. So I do really recommend that book. Ron is also the co-editing with David Lindbergh, the 8-volume Cambridge History of Science series, being published by Cambridge University Press just down the road, and also is involved in a huge number of other publishing projects. So very, very prolific writer. And we're delighted he's going to speak to us this morning on why creationism is so popular in America. Thanks, Ron.
Now, I was assigned this topic. I didn't choose it. But I think it's a worthwhile topic to explore. I may not have come up with the same answers that others of you here might come up with. Fortunately, we have a few Americans scattered throughout the room, so that if I don't nail the answer, there are other people here who can at least give personal testimonies as to why they are anti-evolutionists. Now, I think we can establish fairly conclusively that large numbers of Americans are creationists. Establishing what that means is a much different task altogether. For about, over 2 decades now, the Gallup organization has asked the same question about at least every 2 years or so of Americans. Do you believe that the first human beings appeared, sometimes as described in the Bible, no more than 10,000 years ago? And the rate of response to that question has been fairly constant over time. Roughly between 43 and 48% of Americans will say that they believe the first humans are not more than 10,000 years old. Now, for our purposes, that may not be the best question to ask, because it doesn't distinguish, for example, among people who are old Earth creationists, if that term is familiar to you, young Earth creationists, or followers of intelligent design. So it's not as accurate and refined an instrument as we might want. In recent years, other pollsters have tried to get a somewhat better handle on the question of how many Americans are creationists by asking questions such as, do you self-identify as a creationist or lean toward creationism? And there you get a truly astounding figure of about 65.5%. So roughly 2/3 of Americans identify as creationists or lean toward creationism. Again, you don't know exactly what they mean, because there are some people who accept theistic evolutionists who would, under certain circumstances, still identify as a creationist. There are a number of intelligent design theorists who, if given a minute or two to explain their answer, would say, yes, I am a creationist as well. I think that in the modern world, that only Turkey has a higher percentage of adults who profess not to believe in evolution. So it's fair enough to ask the question, why are Americans so committed to creationism, with the underlying implication that this is fairly distinctive, at least among civilized peoples. for us to be so committed to creationism. Now, as a historian and not a sociologist, I tend to be very skeptical about sweeping generalizations. I mean, my first reaction when Dennis asked me to write on this was, yeah, I know what he thinks is the answer, that people in Europe, especially in England, are smarter than Americans. That is not the answer. We may be more devout. That may be a possibility. I don't think that answers about social economic deprivation get you anywhere. The few studies with which I'm familiar would indicate that the populations from which the creationists draw most of their followers tend to fit the normal distribution socioeconomically in the United States. There's a slight skewing toward being undereducated, although the Gallup polls have shown that roughly a quarter of all college graduates in America regard themselves as creationists. So just because you go to college doesn't mean you're going to become an evolutionist. Now, as I say, it's skewed. The less education you have, the more you're likely to be a creationist. Ethnically, creationism is slightly more popular among African American populations in the United States, and you get some refinements like that. But basically, it is a phenomenon that crosses almost all social, economic, and educational groups. Maybe politics. I wonder if it's possible to find a democratic creationist. There aren't that many. I have found a few, but most of them tend not to be in the democratic camp. So what are the reasons? Let's get down to explanations that I think carry some weight. And again, let me just say that not only do I think that these sweeping sociological explanations don't work, even when we get down to more significant ones, theological ones, it's very hard to generalize. I've spent far too much time trying to come up with good generalizations here and have been frustrated. You can get somewhere by looking at individual theologies, or group theologies is what I mean, that there are peculiar reasons, for example, why Seventh-day Adventists are so committed to it, or why Mormon creationists, and all Mormons aren't creationists, but there is a significant group, why they are, why many Southern Baptists are, or why other groups. But the explanations you have, Missouri Lutherans, as you'll see in a few minutes, have been very active in this area. And their motivations have been quite different from, say, Mormons or Adventists or people in the Church of Christ. So, even theologically, we're not going to get the simplistic or simple explanations that some people would want. I am convinced, after studying this phenomenon for a long time, that no factor has played a more important role than attitudes toward the Bible. I really think that that is not the exclusive, but the single most important explanation for why people are rejecting evolution. Now, here we may just get in a question-begging mode. Then the question would be, why do more Americans believe in the Bible than people in this room, perhaps? Maybe the explanation there is that we, at least since the early revolutionary period, have never had a state church. And that when people engage in religious activities voluntarily, they tend to be a little more committed to the religious traditions than in Europe, for example, where you often have a state church, and what you do isn't so much a voluntary act as it is for the United States, and you don't have quite the marketplace that you would have in the U.S. over here. Although I know that there are Baptists and Presbyterians and other, what do you call yourselves over here?
Nonconformists.
Nonconformists, yes. Who struggle to be like the Americans. Now, I am a historian, so a lot of what I'm going to say will be historical. Unlike some other people who can tell you what is true and what is false, I just tell you what actually happened. So you might not find that as satisfying as, I'm not Michael, who will, at the end, he's waving his hands, he will tell you whether I'm right or wrong about this. One of the surprises in the area of biblical interpretation, which, as I said, was crucial, is the change that has taken place during the past 100 years or so. Among American anti-evolutionists, and that was the term of choice until well into the 20th century, creationism wasn't widely used, creationist wasn't widely used, even through the 1920s. You had anti-evolutionists, okay? What did the anti-evolutionists believe about the Bible? Well, specifically we want to know, what did anti-evolutionists believe about the first chapters of the Bible that discuss the creation, and we might even go as far as to include Noah's flood here. At the height of the anti-evolution movement of the 1920s, associated with William Jennings Bryan and the notorious Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925, almost all of the anti-evolutionists who left a written record, and we just don't know what the silent majority believed, but of those who left a written record, almost all of them were willing to accept the evidence for the antiquity of life on Earth and attached almost no geological significance to Noah's flood. Now, if you're familiar with the creationist writings of the last 30 years or so, that would be a very counterintuitive generalization to make. But the only group in the 1920s, the only religious group in the 1920s that rejected the evidence for antiquity of life on Earth and attached weight to Noah's flood to explain the fossil record were concentrated in a very small denomination, as they like to be called. Others call them a cult, the Seventh-day Adventists. So one of the questions, one of the trends that we need to trace is how that minority view among anti-evolutionists, among fundamentalists in the 1920s and 30s became, by the 1970s and 80s, perhaps the dominant in interpretation. What did anti-evolutionists believe? Well, they were split into two large camps during the first half or two-thirds of the 20th century in America. Less numerically strong, but probably more culturally influential, were the advocates of the so-called Day Age theory. Went back a long way. I mean, some people would go back all the way to St. Augustine for this view, that you should not associate the days of Genesis 1 with literal 24-hour periods. That particular interpretation came in very handily in the early 19th century when geologists constructed the geological column with which you're all familiar. Now, between roughly 1810 and 1840, geologists constructed this column representing the history of life on Earth. Many of these geologists were Christians. a number of them were evangelical Christians. Now, the meaning of evangelical has not been stable over time either. But people who took the Bible very seriously and began suggesting that one could accommodate this evidence, this very clear, compelling evidence from studying nature of long periods of time by interpreting the days as geological ages, without feeling that in any way they had compromised the truth of the Bible. They might regard themselves, and this gets back to a question that came up last night with Michael, as people reading the Bible literally. This is one of the trickiest labels in this whole area is, what does it mean to be a biblical literalist? Well, the people who are the most literal readers of the Bible spend a lot of time interpreting the symbols of Daniel and Revelation. Are they literalists? Well, they sort of self-identify as literalists, and certainly their critics see them as literalists, but in a literal way, they're not literalists very often. So these people did not feel that they were compromising their reading of Scripture at all, but were interpreting it in the light of recent scientific knowledge and a viewpoint that was extremely popular and had been for a few centuries already, was this notion that God had revealed himself in two books, the Scriptures and the book of nature, and that since he was the author of both, they could not conflict, and so you were compelled to work out some sort of harmonizing scheme between these two. Now, you might be suspicious about my claim that the day-age theory was popular among the fundamentalists. Let me just give you three quick examples. One, between 1910 and 1915, conservative evangelical Christians in the United States published a series of pamphlets called The Fundamentals. It's probably what gave the name to the movement about 1920, the fundamentalist movement. The person asked by the editors of the Fundamentals to contribute an essay on evolution was George Frederick Wright, who was a strong advocate of the day-age theory. His intellectual biography is even more interesting because in the 1870s and 1880s, he was one of the foremost Christian Darwinists in America. Then he got scared by higher criticism and ran more toward the conservative side, and ended up his life being identified with the fundamentalist movement. So you could consider this essay, which appeared in the Fundamentals, to be the first statement by American fundamentalists on evolution and religion, and that was one committed to the day-age theory. In 1919, a Baptist minister in the Twin Cities, that's Minneapolis-St. Paul, Minnesota, the United States, founded the World's Christian Fundamentals Association. This was the biggest, most active fundamentalist group in America. And William Bell Riley was widely known for promoting the day-age explanation of Genesis 1 as a way to harmonize the compelling evidence from geology and paleontology. And then when it was Riley and the World's Christian Fundamentals Association that recruited the most famous anti-evolutionist in America, William Jennings Bryan, to go down and assist with the prosecution in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. Now, if you've seen the movie Inherit the Wind, which too many people have seen, and which seems to provide the basis for textbook accounts of what happened in Dayton, you know that William Jennings Bryan believed that the creation occurred in 4004 BC, October 22 at 9 a.m. Central Standard Time, or something like that. There's a caricature of him in there. In truth, Bryan agreed totally with Riley about the day-age theory. He had always in his public statements endorsed the day-age theory. And he said at one point, a few years before the Scopes trial, only our critics try to tie us down and think that we don't go beyond 24-hour days about 6,000 years ago. In fact, this attitude was illustrated during the testimony, Brian's testimony at the trial. Very unusual move. The defense attorney, Clarence Darrow, a very prominent agnostic in America, called Brian to the witness stand as an expert on the Bible. Now, you don't get to call the opposing attorneys and put them on the stand during trials in America. But Brian was very happy to testify to his belief in the Bible, considered himself something of an expert in that area. And the trial transcript has been available in printed form since late 1925. So I don't know how so many people have gotten it wrong. It's not as though it's difficult. But clearly Darrow thought that Brian, being a fundamentalist, would have supported and defended the notion of a recent special creation. And finally, Brian erupts at one point in this examination and says, we don't care whether the creation week was 6 days, 6,000 years, or 600 million years. It makes no difference to us who are defending the inspiration of the Bible. So, for the fundamentalists, and nobody would represent them better, although he was a little squishy about it, taking the term on, represented by William Jennings Bryan, by William Bell Riley, by George Frederick Wright, were quite happy with this notion of days representing ages. And people in the audience did not go, and think that Brian had sold them down the river when he had admitted this under great pressure from Darrow. This was the view with which he was publicly associated. Perhaps even more popular, we didn't have Gallup around in the 1920s or 30s, but perhaps more popular among rank and file conservative Christians during the first half of the 20th century was another view known as the gap interpretation. This had again become popular during that period from 1810 to 1840 when the geological column was being constructed, and Christians were trying to find a way to accommodate it. And some said, there's an easy way. Just read your Bible carefully. If you read Genesis 1, it says, and unlike in America where I can never assume that even my students are familiar with Genesis 1 or Noah or anybody, this group I can tell knows what Genesis 1 says. Right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay? The author, presumably Moses, almost all of my people would say it was Moses for sure. In the beginning, God created the heavens. Then the author skips over in silence a huge period of cosmic and earth history and gets to the Edenic creation associated with Adam and Eve at some point in the future, giving the conservative exegete a huge gap between the two creations. Now this has nothing to do with the two creation stories in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. This is the two creation stories in the first 3 verses of Genesis 1. In the beginning, and then the Edenic creation, probably about 6,000 years ago, probably when the first humans appeared. But you could slip in the entire geological column between those two creations. And that's exactly what the advocates of this did. Now, the reason that was so popular among conservatives, and here I'm talking about the fundamentalists and among Pentecostals, who were starting to grow fairly rapidly already in the early 20th century. The reason they were so inclined to this is because they read it in their Bibles. Literally read it in their Bibles. The most popular version, or the most popular edition of the King James Version of the Bible was the Scofield Reference Bible. It was published by Oxford University Press, but it was produced in the United States. The editor was Cyrus Scofield, a biblical, legal and biblical scholar, who decided to produce an edition in 1909 of the King James Version with helpful editorial comments. Because if you've spent any time with the Bible, you know that it is not always as clear as you might want. Hence all the different religious denominations. So Scofield went through adding these footnotes explaining the difficult passages of the Bible. And Genesis 1, down at the bottom of the page, he explains that Moses was really teaching this gap interpretation of two creations. Now, if you look up in the little margin that runs down, you'll see 4004 BC. But if you look carefully, 4004 BC was the date of the Edenic restoration, not the creation in the beginning. So you're able to salvage 4004, you're able to salvage the recent appearance of the first humans, but pre-human life then, all the record that's revealed in the fossil record, all the evidence that you find in the fossil record, then would predate 4004 BC. As I say, this was immensely popular. And at times, anti-evolutionist preachers would engage in public debates. Before television, this is how Christians got their entertainment, watching preachers debate each other. And one of the most popular anti-evolutionists of the 20s and 30s was a guy named Harry Rimmer. Harry Rimmer was a little bit unusual in this community because he had some medical training. He had attended a homeopathic school for 2 terms, never got his MD degree before he became a Presbyterian minister and liked to present himself as a research scientist. And he was convinced very much that the gap theory was the correct way to interpret Genesis. And he and William Bell Riley had a huge debate that was then published as a pamphlet. And it was so popular in the Midwest that they actually reenacted the debate in the Los Angeles area for the benefit of Christians out there. Now, as I said, you had a very small group of fundamentalist Christians, known as the Seventh-day Adventists, who were endorsing and promoting the idea that no life had existed on earth before the Edenic creation. And this was the huge challenge to Christians that had led to these, that had made these 2 interpretations so popular. That is, what do you do with the evidence from the fossil record? I mean, it's just, you can't ignore it. These people said it was all laid down during the 1 year of Noah's flood. So in one swoop, well, at least in 1 year, they were able to set aside the evidence that had pushed conservative Christians into these accommodating positions and say, hey, it isn't evidence of hundreds of millions of years. It's evidence of what happened in 1 year, so we don't need to interpret days as long periods or invent gaps that a really, really literal reading of Genesis would show never existed. Now, where did they get their commitment to this? Well, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was founded by a woman visionary, started out at 17 going into trances and having visions where God revealed things past, present, and future. On one occasion, she was concerned about the correct interpretation of Genesis 1. And God actually took her back in vision to witness the creation. You can't have better authority than this. She was an eyewitness of the creation. And saw that it was in 6 days of 24 hours each. Other inspirations revealed the role of Noah's flood in all this. A Canadian, and it's really nice to blame the Canadians on this, named George McCready Price. As a teenager, he and his mother converted to Seventh-day Adventism and accepted the authority of Ellen White, which Seventh-day Adventists believe is on a par with that of the biblical writers. And in 1902, began publishing on this topic. And by the mid-1920s, had become what the journal Science called the principal scientific authority of the fundamentalists. He wrote books all over the place. He wasn't a good public speaker. William Jennings Bryan tried to get him to come over and testify at the Scopes trial, but Price was then teaching just outside of London and trying to convert the British to his way of thinking. He spent a lot of time with the people at the Victoria Institute who were somewhat resistant to his efforts to export the fundamentalist controversy over here. And although they gave him a prize eventually, they never really warmed up to his particular interpretation. There was one strange thing about Price. Although virtually every other anti-evolutionist during this period cited him approvingly for his arguments against evolution and for his defense of a historical flood, not one of them, of the prominent ones, abandoned the day, age, or gap theory for this, what was coming to be known as flood geology interpretation of Genesis. So he's a major figure in the anti-evolution movement, but a minor figure when it comes to interpreting the scriptures. It's not until the early 1960s that this particular interpretation starts becoming the interpretation among fundamentalists in the United States. We know why. In 1961, two fundamentalists, one a biblical scholar named John Whitcomb, the other a hydraulic engineer named Henry Morris, both bright, well-educated people. Whitcomb was trained at Princeton College. Morris was trained at Rice University in Houston and then got a PhD at the University of Minnesota. Collaborated on updating and presenting Price's flood geology to the larger evangelical world. The title of their book was The Genesis Flood. Note, they're still focusing on the flood. It's not the 6 days of creation, it's the Genesis flood. And because of Price's association, identification with the Seventh-day Adventists, who were marginal to fundamentalists, it's kind of funny. The more conservative you are, Christian, and the more fundamentalist you are, the more likely you are to regard Adventists as a cult, because they have this extra biblical source of revelation. So many of these fundamentalists were skittish about allowing any Adventist influence to filter in. So in effect, Whitcomb and Morris took this cultish idea of George McCready Price's, gave it a proper fundamentalist baptism, and started circulating this among their fellow believers. It had a tremendous influence, generated lots of discussion. 2 years after its appearance, a group of very conservative Christians came together to form the Creation Science Society. Creation Research Society. in 1963. Again, these were not stupid people. Half of the 10 founders of the Creation Research Societies had earned PhDs in the biological sciences. Another one had a PhD in biochemistry from the University of California, Berkeley. Couldn't do much better than that. You didn't say I got my PhD at Berkeley, did you? Another one was Henry Morris, who had a PhD in hydraulic engineering from Minnesota. Another one had a master's degree in biology. So these weren't people who knew nothing about science or even about biology. They were people who had decided for biblical reasons to take a stand against evolution. About half of these people, about half of the founders of the Creation Research Society, were members of the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. Now, why would Missouri Lutherans, as they're sometimes called, be so interested in this? The Missouri Synod was, well, there, along with a few smaller synods in the U.S., was the most literalistic of all the religious groups in America. In fact, they were known in Lutheran circles in the early 20th century for supporting geocentrism. And down to the present, if you find a geocentrist in the U.S., you can bet a substantial amount of money. That person is either a current or former Missouri Lutheran. Some of you are familiar with the Bible Science newsletter edited by Walter Lang for years. He was a Missouri Lutheran, and sure enough, you would sometimes find pieces in there embracing geocentrism, which then embarrassed the more legitimate young earth creationists at the time. So here you have people who took the Bible extremely literally, who had imported in the mid-century George McCready Price's views, and so we're starting to push flood geology. Now, flood geology in roughly 1970, plus or minus 12 months, gets renamed as creation science or scientific creationism. It's the same thing as flood geology, or as what some people might call just straight out biblical creationism. But the advocates wanted to have a shot at getting into the public schools in the U.S. And so they created two versions of flood geology. One was for Christians, which referred to Adam and Eve and Noah and the flood. The other one was for general readers, that was stripped of all the biblical references. The sequence of events is the same. The chronology is the same, but there's no mention of the biblical characters in there. And that was scientific creationism. So scientific creationism is identical with biblical creationism without the references to the Bible. One of the most difficult things historically to explain, at least I have found it difficult to explain, is why at the very time more and more conservative Christians are going on for higher education in the sciences. You didn't have a single person back in the 20s with even so much as a master's degree in biology. Now you have 5 or 6 people with PhDs in biology in the 1960s. Why conservative Christians abandon these very legitimate fundamentalist interpretations of Scripture, gap and day age, which allowed them to accept the evidence of the antiquity of life on earth for this radical, cultish idea that put them at odds with some of the most compelling scientific evidence that had ever been revealed. I can explain the timing of this pretty well. Again, there were a number of factors that converged in the late 50s and 60s. One of them was the centennial of Darwin's Origin of Species, 1859, 1959. There were lots of celebrations, and scientists were starting to feel their oats a little bit. and making claims about Darwinism, and that annoyed some of the creationists. The single most important factor, however, was Sputnik. Okay. Late 50s, the Russians are successful in launching Sputnik. That really struck Americans in a vulnerable spot because we were supposed to be number one in the world. And now we weren't going to be number one into space. So American scientists and educators generally went into this self-reflective mode. Why did we slip behind the Russians? The obvious answer was our science education wasn't up to snuff. And so the federal government started pumping large amounts of money into improving science education. In the area of biology, the federal funds went to support a group that headquartered itself in Colorado called the Biological Sciences Curriculum Study, BSCS. The president of the Creation Science Foundation used to like to say it was mostly BS. But can Christians do that? I know Michael Roos talks that way, but this is a good Christian Lutheran.
Michael Roos wouldn't use the abbreviation.
He would not use the you got it. Yeah. And so, by the early 1960s, the products of this group, the textbooks for high school students, a series of textbooks featuring evolution began to appear. And about half of the school districts in the U.S. adopted one or more of these texts. So after having very little, if any, evolution in the high school curriculum, then all of a sudden in the 60s you have this in-your-face evolutionism coming in and supported by the government. And that really, really annoyed many conservative Christians. But that still doesn't explain, just because your anti-evolution fervor is increasing, doesn't explain one bit why you should move from day age or gap to creation science or flageology. And I better move on here, but the one explanation that seems to crop up, well, two things I'll say. One, a lot of conservative Christians by this time had grown frustrated with always following science. Science would make a discovery, and then the Christians are supposed to reread their Bible as if it had anticipated this. And some start saying, where will this end? Let's start. We know the Bible is God's Word. Why don't we start with the Bible, establish what that means, and then see if we can fit the evidence of nature into that framework. So you find a number of people, including Whitcomb and Morris and others, who are saying, we just got things twisted in terms of process here. Another factor that I thought was going to be important, and it assumes some importance in a book called The Creation Evolution Struggles by Michael Roos, has to do with eschatology. Many of the most ardent young earth creationists, scientific creationists if you will, are committed to this view because they believe in the imminent return of Jesus. They believe in the imminent return because of their literal, if you will, interpretation of the prophecies in Daniel and Revelation, especially Revelation. And they have argued successfully that it makes no sense to tell people that they need to take the last book of the Bible literally, in a sense. But it's okay to take the first one symbolically or figuratively. They even sometimes use the language, we need a common hermeneutic. Don't find fundamentalists talking about hermeneutics very often, but sometimes you will. We need a common hermeneutic that will take both the beginning and the end, literally. So they say, it's not that we're just obsessed with the scientific question of evolution. It's that we must establish that reading of the first books of the Bible in order to be consistent in the message that we want to send about the imminent end of the world. Gives you some urgency there. Now, as I say, a number of the people believed in that. The trouble is, as I said, half of the founders of the Creation Research Society were Missouri Lutherans. Missouri Lutherans aren't premillennialists. They're all millennialists. Some very active anti-evolutionists in America come from the Churches of Christ. Churches of Christ aren't premillennialists. They're all millennialists. So it doesn't cover some of the most committed young earth creationists. Now, I do think that most young earth creationists believe in the imminent return, but their eschatology would be somewhat different. Okay. So I think, without doubt, biblical concerns have driven most of the creationism in America, and as you know, we have lots and lots of very conservative Christians in America. Okay, some other points here, because I promised Dennis I would not go over my allotted moral concerns. From the very beginning, critics of evolution in America have been concerned about the moral implications of evolution, particularly the Darwinian emphasis on struggle. This reached a peak in the 1920s in the wake of World War I, when some works came out showing that the German military had imbibed of Darwinism, reduced to slogans such as might makes right, survival of the fittest, and that it was their understanding of Darwinism that had provided the intellectual foundation for the German military during World War I. And the German military, maybe they deserved it, but they were crucified in the American press during World War I. After all, you know, the German soldiers were poisoning Belgian kids with candy, and they were engaged in all sorts of barbaric acts. Some of the posters that the government produced during this time, you know, were beat back the Hun, and they would show German soldiers dragging young women bleeding by the hair. It was a visceral time. I mean, we had to quit teaching German in the public schools of America. In my state of Wisconsin, there was has huge German population, and one of the communities near Milwaukee was New Berlin, which changed its name to New Berlin. Today it's New Berlin. You can't say Berlin anymore. So you had this backlash against the use, and this was a concern not only of Christians such as Brian, but in the biological community. So you have a fair amount of activity in the 20s and 30s among American biologists to construct a theory of evolution that emphasized cooperation more than conflict. So the argument was, from the fundamentalists, oh yeah, World War I was a natural consequence of teaching Darwinism. And from the biological community, this was a perversion of Darwinism that focused too much on struggle and applications to human society. And we need to start teaching and promoting a more cooperative view of evolution that was particularly strong at the University of Chicago during this period. Also, just before the Scopes trial, early 1920s, there was a major trial. We had a whole bunch of trials of the century. This was one of those where two students who had attended the University of Chicago had killed a little boy named Bobby Franks. Their defense attorney was none other than Clarence Darrow. And the kids who did it, the young men who did it, were Leopold and Loeb. And it turned out that they had become evolutionists at the University of Chicago. And apparently, they had become convinced, because they were evolutionists, or at least this is how this was presented in the press, that they had come to devalue human life. There was nothing special about human life over animal life. And so they just, for the sheer fun of it, for the excitement of it, had killed Bobby Franks. When this trial occurred, then, you got lots of testimony, lots of stories circulating about the dire effects of teaching evolution on the ethical behavior of young people in America. And surprising as it may seem, the adults during this period thought American young people were going to hell in a handbasket. Now, they always think that. Every generation thinks the young people are doing. Well, at this time, the critics focused, why are Americans behaving this way? Well, for the first time, they were teaching evolution. That's what's doing it. So there's this strong concern about what Darwinism will do to public behavior. As some would say, if you teach children that they are nothing but animals, you can't be surprised if they behave like animals. The theme about the moral implications of evolution continues down to the present. If you read some of the writings of the most fervent anti-evolutionists in America, you will still see time and time again that evolution is responsible for the high abortion rate. It's responsible for the drug problem. It's responsible for the AIDS epidemic. It's responsible for the worst thing that's ever hit America, feminism. Evolution, in some of the journals, and you can see the close connection between that. So evolution can be responsible for just about anything you don't like. It's a little bit logically like the connection between the dairy industry and alcoholism. Do you know that just about every alcoholic in America started with milk? Another reason why Americans have not warmed up to evolution more than they have is because it's counterintuitive. It flies in the face of common sense. I'll give two quick examples. William Jennings Bryan was not willing to accept human evolution, but he was willing to accept, if scientists were to demonstrate it, pre-human evolution of plants and animals. He wasn't opposed to that on theological grounds at all. But he thought it was silly. As he traveled around America, it was one of the most popular lectures in America, giving his standard lectures against evolution. This was one of his favorite stories, and mine too, of course. How do evolutionists accept the origin of the eye? Now, that's tricky. I mean, even Darwin woke up with cold sweats worrying about that one. Well, Bryan said he'd been reading the literature, and evolutionists think that way back when, some little animal got a mole. And they noticed that when the sun would shine on it, it felt good. So they would keep rotating with the sun to make sure that they got the maximum amount of sunlight. Over a period of time, this spot became optically sensitive, and over millions of years, it turned into the eye. And the punchline was always, and can you believe it happened not once but twice? Well, you got to wonder a little bit, if you start thinking that literally about them. I'm sure there are people here who can explain why it happened twice. It's the same sort of argument that is driving the sympathy for intelligent design. Irreducible complexity. You study particularly the biological world, and you can now see how incredibly complex it is. So complex that there must have been an intelligent designer or God. And regardless of one's religious affiliation, I think there is a fairly widespread sense of, boy, this just couldn't have happened. I don't believe it happened, especially without God doing this. Okay, two final points here, and I have 2 minutes, one each. Okay, one is, do not believe that this opposition to evolution illustrates an anti-scientific position. It may to you, but it is really hard to find in the fundamentalist creationist literature statements of opposition to science. These people love science. In fact, one of the reasons they oppose evolution is they think it gives science a bad name. This is a speculation, a theory. Science is solid evidence you can trust. It will get you to the moon. It will make bombs. You've never seen evolution happen, so it shouldn't be able to use the good name of science. So their self-image is of typically very, very pro-science. Lastly, I can deal with this in the question and answer period, but the assigned topic does suggest that Americans are on the lunatic fringe here. That it's the American embrace of creationism that we need to explain. Well, folks, this is just a prelude to what the rest of the world is going to be facing. And I can give you some evidence if you want it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron, for that overview. And certainly, Americans are certainly good at exporting things as well, so one has to say, quite an export flow in this direction. Questions, Rodney? Yes. So, yeah.
You mentioned geocentrism, and I must admit, I wonder why the vast majority aren't actually creationists aren't geocentrics. After all, the Bible talks about the earth being so steadfast that it shall not be moved, the sun coming up like a bridegroom, Joshua's long day.
Can we just stop, Rodney, while we get the...
Sorry.
Would you like to turn off your mic on there? Otherwise we pick up wow in the thing. And then if you could use that mic here, just give you a...
I don't know how to turn it.
Yeah, I can turn off or you can... Yeah, so we just need to press it down for a couple of seconds. And I think Jason's got the... Can you give the microphone to Rodney? So thanks, Jason. Yeah. There we go. Thanks.
Yes, you mentioned geocentrism, and I just wonder why the vast majority of creationists aren't geocentrics, because the Bible speaks about the earth being so steadfast it shall not be moved, the sun coming up like a bridegroom, Joshua's long day where the sun is.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I think, is this on? Or do I not need this?
No, use it, yeah, because that feeds into the film. Yeah. So.
I think the most obvious reason is that Christians want to accept scientific evidence by and large. That's why even the most conservative, even the fundamentalists in the early 20th century were willing to reinterpret the meaning of Genesis 1, to accept the evidence for the antiquity of life on earth. Most Bible-believing Christians go out of their way to accommodate science. It's only when they see something really, really challenging, human evolution. Bringing humans into the story is where you really have the major problems. But then you have this fringe, if you will, of people who say, hey, I am so much a literalist that I can't even accept heliocentrism.
Yes, another question here.
Yeah, you described this sort of anti-German sentiment and connected to the adversity against struggle for life, survival of the fittest. But I thought actually that in the same period that social Darwinism was somewhat of a popular thing.
What is social Darwinism?
Well, this eugenics kind of movement, and so led up to this idea of the survival of the fittest, sort of like leading up to Nazi Germany. No, it's not? Okay, I may be confused.
No, you have a good textbook understanding, but it didn't happen that way.
Okay, so how did it happen?
No, well, I have real problems with social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was a term rarely used before the 1940s. And then it came to be used primarily for all the applications of evolution that you didn't like. Okay. So, as a historian, the question I want to ask is, how did people who accepted evolution, beginning with Darwin and going on down, to what extent did they apply the ideas to human societies? And they're all over the place. I mean, Darwin was not reluctant to apply his theories to humans. He didn't do this most of the time, but as Michael was suggesting last night, he had some very nasty things to say about the Irish and other groups of people in terms of human evolution. He applied human evolution. He applied Darwinism to humans. But the prime examples of social Darwinism had nothing to do with Darwinism. As this myth of social Darwinism came into existence. The military rarely used Darwin to justify what they're doing. Maybe these Germans in World War I, but the American military wasn't using Darwinism. You'd had wars since the beginning of human history. You didn't need this. Racism. Rarely did this enter into justifications for racial behavior. American capitalism. A number of years ago, an American historian went through all the testimony of American businessmen before the U.S. Congress on the assumption that if ever U.S. businessmen were going to invoke Darwinism, it would be when they were on the national stage. Never. He didn't find a single instance of an American businessman using Darwinism to justify, capitalism in America. You can find 2, maybe 3 businessmen making throwaway statements. Clearly, Andrew Carnegie was a big fan of Spencer's, if not Darwinism. So if you go through the various areas where social Darwinism was supposed to have been strong, there's almost no influence of Darwinism there. That's why I kind of poo-poo the notion of reducing all these behaviors to the influence of Darwinism.
Yes, Ernest.
I just want to pick up and underline your closing comments about the creationists' use of science, and indeed, if you like, one might say love of science. One of my students has just written a master's thesis in which he's analysed the writings of Ham and Sarfati, who are quite popular in this country at the moment. And 2 things he's identified. One is their view of science is a very Baconian one. It's very much what is observed in the laboratory, if you like. Now that's going to cause them problems with large swathes of modern science, which of course work at a higher level, like evolution does. But the second thing is there's a tension there that on the one hand, as you said earlier in your talk, they want to say we start with the Bible, not with science. And yet on the other hand, they're very keen to use science to support their interpretation of the Bible. And that leads to a tension.
I agree. I agree with everything you said except the Baconian stuff. These creationists, by and large, wouldn't know bacon from ham.
That was terrible. Okay, next question. Francis, can we have the mic up here and then we'll go to the other side. So thanks, Jason.
So you didn't say a whole lot about intelligent design, this arrival on the scene only about 20 years ago, and the way in which so many in the evangelical church have embraced this, perhaps in part because it seems like a defense against evolution, which is still seen as an atheistic perspective. Intelligent design seems to have a particularly peculiar gaggle of admirers in the sense that many of the leaders of that enterprise are now increasingly open about their support of descent from a common ancestor, including of humans. If you read Michael Behe's most recent book, The Edge of Evolution, he makes it absolutely clear that he finds the evidence for evolutionary origins of humanity to be open and shut, absolutely straightforward, clear, can't argue with that. And yet I suspect many of the people who identify themselves with ID from the church don't share that view and would probably be fairly horrified to discover that that is in fact the way that this is being formulated by one of the scientific leaders of the enterprise. So what do you make of that, this unusual kind of latest cultural development where you have something that is attracting people towards a movement, but actually the fundamentals of the movement aren't even agreed upon in terms of what it stands for?
Well, I have 22 minutes to answer this, right? I ran out of time, and I had intelligent design was going to come next. So
I
thank
thought
you
it
for
was
this.
probably waiting. Yeah.
Yeah, but I had promised to stop after an hour.
This is
It is an interesting phenomenon. Well, that's a throwaway line. Everything's interesting to me, and very confusing in many ways. I think that few people, even few people, who profess to believe in intelligent design know what they're talking about. My favorite example, I was flying back from an intelligent design meeting a few years ago at Waco, from Waco, Texas. And the gentleman next to me was reading Philip Johnson's book. And I thought, well, maybe he's coming back from that. Well, so I played dumb, or just was natural. And I said, oh, what kind of a book is that? And he says, oh, well, this is about evolution. I said, well, what does it say? And so he started telling me. He had a master's degree in engineering, was a successful businessman, and was just reading this for his own interest. Didn't know there had been a meeting at Baylor. So I said, well, what does it do with the fossils? And he said, oh, of course, the fossils were all laid down during Noah's flood. So I started really pushing it. Now, what had happened? If you've read Philip Johnson never mentions Noah's flood. He doesn't care where the geological column came from. This guy, an intelligent person, was conflating the two. Yeah. And he just, in his reading, he was reading all this young earth creationism into a book on intelligent design. I never told him he was dead wrong, because he seemed so happy with this idea that I didn't want to disabuse him of that. As you point out, Michael Behe accepts common descent. I think he's a rare bird in the camp. I don't think that Johnson does. In fact, Philip Johnson has gotten more and more conservative. He's doing more things with young earth creationists. As some of you may know, one of his big crusades right now is cross-dressing. Now that's going to give intelligent design a bad name. He's really concerned about cross-dressing and the evils of cross-dressing.
You might need to explain that. Different expressions and different languages for these things.
I need somebody from California. Jeff knows all about that. It is one of the great evils of our time, but...
is that caused by evolution, or is that... All right.
I don't know. Bill Dembski is willing to acknowledge that Behe is a tried and true intelligent designer, and so one can be an advocate of intelligent design and believe in common descent, but he doesn't. And I think he represents the majority. But we really don't know what the majority opinion is there. The one thing, I think most people I know, sort of lay people who like intelligent design and think it should, see it as a sort of natural theology. It's like the eye in the 19th, early 20th century. It's so complex. How could this have happened? It's a form, it's natural. The only problem with that is that almost to a person, the leaders of the ID group say, this is not natural theology. It has nothing to do with theology. This is a scientific interpretation. And then they go on to say what historians of science, Michael Behe has said, as you probably know, that this revolution, that this scientific revolution, should go down in the annals of science along with the Newtonian, Einsteinian, Lavoisier, and all the... They regard it as a huge scientific revolution. And of course, if they had discovered scientific evidence of a designer, they deserve. My next book, I'm going to put that right in the long line of Darwin, Newton, and Einstein. There are other places I'd like to go with that, but I shouldn't take the time.
Question over here.
I found your talk about the history of creationism in the US very interesting. You're talking under the heading, why is creationism so popular? And I want to draw you out a wee bit on why it should be so popular in the US. You did make a comment, there are lots and lots of very conservative Christians in the US, and that's an observation that my very cursory visits, observations from visits to the US,
would support. I wonder if that is the reason why creationism is so popular in the US. And if it is, could you explain why there are so many conservatives in the US? Why it is, you know, a preponderantly conservative place compared perhaps with Europe? That seems to be what you were implying.
Oh, yeah. Well, it goes back to the colonial time. God chose the New World to be a city on a hill. And so this is just divine will that we would be, and we still are trying to export this to the rest of the world. I mean, doesn't that just make sense to you? I think a providential explanation is probably the most convincing one that I can come up with. But see, you don't believe that. It is funny that historians tend not to accept the explanations that religious people give, because a lot of Christians would believe that, or when we're studying revivals, we'll use any explanation except that God had something to do with it. You know, it's just, we don't do it. Why are we so religious? I do think that the lack of a state church has been really important. I think that has tended to undermine religious enthusiasm when you are compelled through tax money to support churches. I think that the places where you have state churches haven't prospered as much as the United States. I think that that when you have this open marketplace the way we have had at least since the 18th century in many places, it seems to have paid off. Now maybe that has something to do with some distinctive American psyche. I'm not convinced it does. But even more fundamental, I don't necessarily buy the implication in the assigned title that this is unique to Americans. For example, in the mid-90s, a survey in Canada that was published in Maclean's magazine, not a religious magazine, this is them, asked the same question of Canadians about, do you believe that the first humans were created no more than 10,000 years ago? That year, I think it was 47% of Americans had said they believe in that. Canadians, we know they're much more secular than people in the United States. 53% in Canada. Recent polls here have shown that the majority of British people don't believe in naturalistic evolution. And some 20% are creationists, if you can trust polls. So I think that we have tended to overemphasize the distinctiveness of America. People from Australia, Ken Ham is from Australia. He is the biggest name in creationism in the world today. I'm pretty sure of that. So there are large places. Turkey is just, it's not just Christians. Conservative Muslims, conservative Jews, not conservative Jews, but Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews. If you ever want to have some fun some evening, go on the web for the Torah Science Foundation. It's just like the Creation Science Foundation with a little Kabbalah thrown in. Seriously. So I don't think we're all that special, except in the good ways.
Okay, so we'll have a question here and then one over here. So either.
It's always struck me observing it over the last 30 years or so that one of the reasons why it's been so successful in America is that they've harnessed the techniques of advertising to the promotion of this particular view, and I think that's one of the reasons it's spread to the rest of the world. Creationism has been marketed like Coca-Cola, basically, with a well-funded propaganda program which has bypassed the academic level and has gone straight for the popular market. Would you like to comment on that?
You bet. I agree with you about 50% of what you said. I did, a number of years ago, obtain access to the financial records of the Institute for Creation Research, trying to get an answer to this question. In truth, the Young Earth Creationist initiative has not been the recipient of large amounts of money from wealthy Americans. They have gotten most of their money, $5 and $10 contributions from just followers, from their royalties in their books, from their lecture fees, which they tend to plow right back into the organization. The biggest gift I found was some woman in Southern California, I think, had given a house that they had sold and made $30,000 on it. I was expecting to find like H.L. Hunt or something, if you know people like that. But I've never been able to find any evidence like that for the young Earth creationists. Now, Ken Ham has gotten, he's just finished this $27 million creationist museum, and I think he has gotten some millionaires to give substantial amounts for that. Now, the story, financial story, I think is fundamentally different for the intelligent design people. They're a tiny group, centered institutionally on the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington. You had about 10 people who decided they were going to launch this revolution, but they knew they needed money. They've been extremely clever. And they have a budget, I think, of a few million a year. That has come predominantly from three foundations, three individuals. One of which has supported a lot of evangelicals. Weyerhaeuser, it's a Ford's Products person. He's dead now, but that's where they got a lot of their money from. Then from a McClellan Foundation in Chattanooga. The most interesting and the most generous contributor to this is a strange guy named Howard Amundsen, who is a Christian Reconstructionist. Do you have Christian Reconstructionists over here?
Lots of deconstruction.
Deconstruction, not reconstruction.
Christian Reconstructionists will scare the head off your head. It's already done it with me. These are theocrats who want to reinstitute Old Testament laws around the world, but they're going to start with America. And this guy has donated millions of dollars to underwrite the Intelligent Design Initiative. He has broken with the father of the Christian Reconstructionist movement, is a Presbyterian named Rousas Rushdoony. And Howard Amundsen rarely gives interviews, but in the one interview I found, he said, now, he's trying to show that he's a little more liberal than Rushdoony. And he said, now, I don't believe in stoning gays. He said, I want to convert gays. So at least he's not, he'll kill adulterers, but not gays. So I should say, in all fairness, I don't know of a single theocrat at the Discovery Institute. But back in the Watergate episode, we were always told, follow the money. And I think it's not insignificant that their biggest donor is somebody who is openly promoting theocracy in America. I also find it has been a tremendous public relations success. It's been a total failure scientifically. Virtually no peer-reviewed articles. The one they can claim is from a philosopher of science, given a degree here in philosophy of science. Steve Meyer, yeah. So he doesn't know anything about science. He's a philosopher. They now have 700 names on their site, The Descent from Darwin. There may be people in this room who have signed the Descent from Darwin here. So I tried to figure out, is this good or bad? They seem to think it's incredible that 700 people. So I tried to find out, well, how many scientists are there in the world? That's almost impossible. I finally found from ICSU, I don't know if you're familiar, this is the International Organization of Scientific Unions. The president of ICSU estimates that there are between 3 and 15 million scientists. We don't know how many scientists are. But if you take the small number for scientists, 3 million, then you get a figure of about 0.002 something of the percent of the scientists in the world are willing to sign this ID statement. So it's infinitesimal, not quite infinitesimal, but really, really small. And yet, magazines, journals, newspapers would have you believe that the scientific community is almost split down the middle. You have these evolution wars going. There's a whole page in the latest issue of Newsweek on this sort of thing. So they have taken their money and scored a huge public relations victory. And a tiny, tiny scientific victory is my take on it.
No, you're going. Okay, we'll go at the front then. Yes, thank you.
Someone stated earlier how creationism obviously begins with the Bible, but enjoys having science to support it. So I'm curious to hear more about the current status of these organizations that were set up in the 60s, like the ICR, and these others, and then most recently, of course, with Ken Ham's, as far as what they're actually doing science-wise and how that's perceived from the rest of the scientific community.
Okay, I can easily answer how it's perceived by the rest of the scientific community as just lunatic fringe Christians.
I don't know what these terms mean.
Lunatic fringe?
No.
Crazy.
The initials that you spoke of.
Oh, I'll explain it. I'll explain it. Okay, so you had back in early 1970s, you had the Institute for Creation Research outside of San Diego, which for years was one of the biggest, most influential creationist organization. You now have the most influential creationist organization is headquartered just out of Cincinnati, Ohio, in northern Kentucky, which is Answers in Genesis, which is clearly eclipsed the ICR in terms of worldwide influence. The founder of the Institute for Creation Research was Henry Morris, co-author of the Genesis Flood. He died a year or so ago. There have been problems with succession among his sons. And the natural one who would have succeeded maybe died. There are two sons. One is one has some scientific training. The other is a preacher. And Henry Morris wanted the preacher's son to take over, but he wasn't interested at the time. And so the other one, John, took over. Has not had a thriving existence. And so they've just announced, and the other brother, who didn't take over, was in Dallas, Texas, and they've just set up headquarters in Dallas, Texas. So it looks like, what's his name? Is he Henry Jr. or did Henry Jr. die? Anyway, so now we have, we still have the organization outside of San Diego, but kind of the anointed son is now developing the headquarters in Dallas, Texas. And whether this will all work out, who knows? Whenever children take over, sometimes it doesn't go as well. In the meantime, young Earth creationism is flourishing under Answers in Genesis, which is more openly a biblical. They want the scientific evidence, but they're quite happy to talk about the biblical roots. And Ken Ham is by far the most dynamic speaker in the creationist circuit. A lot of people think that young Earth creationism is dying out and intelligent design has taken over. The problem here, and I'm pretty sure this is the explanation for it, is that most people judge the life of a movement by how much press it's getting. Well, the press has been going to intelligent design for the last 10 years or so, especially with the Dover trial. Now everybody thinks that with the Dover trial, intelligent design is dead. Well, they're crazy there too. But it wasn't until the opening of this Young Earth Museum that then Young Earth's creationists started getting a little press now, and people say, oh, they really didn't die out after all. In truth, we have no idea about the relative strength of these two groups.
But I think also the question is the view of the rest of the scientific community, wasn't it? I mean,
I answered that. They think they're
one...
just a bunch of loonies.
Okay, fine. That's okay. We have time for one. Yes, here. Right there. Thank you. Yes.
Regarding distribution of the belief of creationism in the US, is there any linkage between it and Americans of long-established European origin, as opposed to its distribution among newer Hispanic-type immigrants, and consequently, does that create an approximate geographical distribution of it in the US?
I'm sorry, I missed. Who's asking the question?
Sorry, me.
I can give you sort of an educated guess on this. We don't know specifically, but you've put your finger on what I think is the most important development in the history of Christianity in the last 100 years, and rarely gets factored into science and religion discussions. The Pentecostal movement did begin in the United States in the early 20th century, maybe on January 1, 1900, in Topeka, Kansas, and has prospered so much that as of 2000, over a quarter of all Christians in the world, there are about 2 billion Christians in the world, so over 500 million Christians in the world identify as Pentecostals or Charismatics, which are generic Pentecostals in other churches like Catholic churches or Anglican churches or something like that. So this is huge. Many of the Hispanic immigrants who are coming up, well, many are Catholics, but a lot are Pentecostals coming in. So they tend to be very conservative theologically. I mean, there have been articles written about the browning of American religion because of the large numbers they are much more active churchgoers than your typical American. And because they do tend to be conservative. They tend to be conservative on abortion, whether they're Catholic or Pentecostal, very conservative with respect to evolution. Trouble is, we only have impressionistic accounts. We do not have a good survey that would allow us to pinpoint this as a major hotbed of anti-evolution activity.
Okay, well, I think we're going to stop there because it's time for coffee, and I think we want to thank Ron for a very great survey, so thanks very much.